Sergeant Grace Williams clenched the boarding pass in her hand, her tired eyes scanning the bustling crowd in the airport lobby. After 9 challenging months in Syria, she was finally going home. Memories of her days in combat still weighed heavily on her mind, the rattle of gunfire, sleepless nights, and the faces of comrades who never made it back, but the faint light of anticipation to reunite with her family waiting at home softened her heart. She smiled briefly, imagining the scene of holding her mother close and hearing her sister's bright laughter. First-class boarding for Flight 298 to New York. The announcement echoed, pulling her out of her thoughts. Grace looked down at the ticket in her hand and, to her surprise, saw that, yes, she had a first-class seat. It could have been a mistake or a gift from someone, but she wasn't about to question this stroke of luck. Heading toward the jet bridge, Grace's military boots echoed rhythmically against the cold metal floor, reminding her of nights marching under the star-studded skies of the Middle East. Entering first class, she felt the welcoming warmth of soft leather seats and the gentle glow reflecting off polished surfaces. A flight attendant greeted her with a bright smile. "Welcome, miss. Your seat is 2B, just to the left." Grace nodded, returning the smile. She moved to her seat and placed her heavy military backpack in the overhead compartment. Sitting down, she couldn't help but savor the comfort, such a contrast to the rugged military flight she was used to. Closing her eyes, she felt the peace she had yearned for. But that moment of tranquility didn't last long. A cold, irritated voice sounded right beside her. "You're in the wrong seat." Grace opened her eyes, startled, and met the sharp gaze of a middle-aged man. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair adding to his air of authority. His eyes drifted over her uniform, pausing on her rank insignia, and she could feel the dissatisfaction in his gaze. "This is first class, not for people like you." Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had faced danger and stress on the battlefield, but this disdain and prejudice hurt her in a different, profound way. She kept her voice steady. "I was assigned to this seat, sir. This is my ticket." She held out the ticket as a confirmation. The man scowled, snatching the ticket from her hand aggressively, scrutinizing it as if searching for an error. "There's clearly been a mistake," he muttered. "Someone must have made an error. A person like you couldn't possibly have this seat." A flight attendant approached, trying to maintain a professional smile, but her eyes showed concern as she sensed the tension. "Excuse me, is there an issue here?" she asked, glancing between Grace and the man. The man tilted his chin toward Grace, raising his voice to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "This person here claims she has a first-class ticket. I believe there's been a serious mix-up." The flight attendant looked at Grace's ticket, then smiled calmly. "Everything is correct, sir. Sergeant Williams does indeed have a seat in 2B. The man flushed with embarrassment but still refused to relent. "This is absurd. I don't want my flight ruined by her." Before he could continue, the flight attendant spoke more firmly. "Sir, I ask you to remain calm. Sergeant Williams has a valid ticket and every right to sit here. We need to prepare for the flight. Please find your seat." The man shot Grace a furious look before turning away. Grace sighed, feeling the curious eyes of other passengers on her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. Though it hadn't been gunfire, what had just happened felt like she had gone through a mental battle. As the plane took off, the roar of the engines filled the air, tearing through the sky and seeming to drown all other sounds into oblivion. Grace leaned her head against the window, watching as the roads below grew smaller, the lights shimmering like stars in the night. But her heart felt heavy, unable to find peace even as she soared above the clouds. Memories of the Syrian battlefield flooded back, the deafening explosions, the faces of comrades who were no more, and the long nights she spent keeping watch in the darkness. A nameless sense of loss twisted within her chest. She tried to remind herself that she was going home, that in just a few more hours on this plane, she would be wrapped in her family's embrace. But her mind was a whirl of mixed emotions and unanswerable questions. She gazed out the window, letting the city lights below soothe her mood. Then, in that moment, her eyes accidentally met another pair. The man from earlier, the one who had criticized and doubted her, was seated not far away. But now his gaze held no coldness or anger. Instead, in his eyes, Goss sensed a conflict, as if he were trying to understand something, or perhaps even questioning himself. That look surprised and slightly unsettled her. She turned away, intending to ignore his curious stare, but a thought suddenly struck her. Grace leaned down and opened her backpack, pulling out an old notebook, its pages weathered and yellowed by the sun and wind. It was the journal she had carried through her days on the battlefield, where she had poured out every feeling, every pain that words could not express. She began to write, her thoughts flowing like a flood, filled with emotions she had held back for months. She wrote about all she had experienced, about the close friend who had fallen right before her eyes, about the fear and guilt that came from being the one who survived. The pages soaked up her heart, and in that moment, Grace realized she was writing not only to release her pain but also to seek forgiveness, both for herself and for people like the man beside her, people who carried their own hidden sorrows but could not face them. She wrote as if this were her final chance to say what had never been said, to turn a difficult moment into something more meaningful. Suddenly, a gentle tap on her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts. Startled, Grace looked up and found herself meeting the man's gaze. He stood there, looking a bit awkward and uncertain. "May I sit here?" he asked, his voice no longer cold but instead laced with hesitation. Grace looked at him for a long time, as if searching for what lay hidden behind those conflicted eyes. Then she nodded, gesturing to the empty seat next to her. The man sat down and the air between them grew heavier. In the dimly lit cabin, only the hum of the engines and the soft murmur of other passengers could be heard. They sat there both silent, as if each was trying to find the right words to start a conversation. Finally, the man broke the silence. His voice was softer, tinged with sorrow. "I lost a son to the war. He never came back." He paused, as if uncertain how to continue, his eyes lowered to his hands clasped tightly together. "When I saw you, I just felt that pain again. I couldn't accept that others might come home while my son never could." His eyes were filled with sadness, a grief he had kept buried for so long. Grace felt a similar pain stirring within her, the pain of partings, of witnessing death and being powerless to change it. But above all, she felt a deep empathy between them, as if his grief was somehow a part of her own. Grace exhaled, gently turning the pages of her notebook and showing him the words she had just written. "I understand that sense of loss," she said, her voice softening. "I've also lost dear friends, comrades I never thought I would have to say goodbye to. But the hardest part is going on, facing that emptiness every day." The man took the notebook, turning the pages lightly. He read in silence, his hands trembling, his eyes blurred with tears. He saw lines about sleepless nights, about Grace's struggle with survivor's guilt. "I never thought a soldier like you would feel this way," he whispered. "I assumed you were stronger than that." Grace gave a faint, bittersweet smile. "Strength doesn't mean we don't feel pain. It means that even with pain, we keep getting up." She paused, looking into his eyes. "Maybe we're both looking for comfort in our pain, but sometimes that comfort comes from knowing we can share it with each other." The man looked up at her, and in that moment, a silent connection formed between them. He nodded, as if finding something meaningful in her words. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for sharing, and for showing me that I'm not alone in my grief." They sat together in silence, yet no longer feeling the strange distance between them. It was as if this flight, with all its odd coincidences and tumultuous emotions, had become a bridge linking two people through their shared sorrows. As the plane began its descent, preparing to land in New York, Grace looked out the window and saw the eastern sky gradually brightening with the first light of dawn. She felt a lightness in her heart, a relief she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew she would never forget those who were gone, but perhaps from now on, she could find a new meaning in life. The man stood up and handed the notebook back to her. "Good luck, Grace. I hope you find the peace you truly deserve." He paused, his lips trembling slightly, then added, "And I hope I can find it for myself too." Grace smiled, squeezing his hand one last time. "I believe we will. Thank you for listening." And in that fleeting moment, amidst the chaos of New York's airport, she realized that it's not bullets or bombs that break people, but the words left unspoken. And sometimes, all it takes is a listening ear and an empathetic heart. The plane landed in New York at dawn, with the first rays of sunlight illuminating the runway. Grace stepped off the plane, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet after months spent on the burning sands and harsh winds of the battlefield. The air in New York felt completely different, full of life, but with a constant hum of unending noise. She passed through security, feeling as if time slowed as she walked down the hallway leading to the arrivals area. A strange feeling crept into her heart as she realized that what she had anticipated in coming home wasn't just the hugs and greetings. It was also a confrontation with herself, with the things she had experienced and the losses she could never erase. And then, through the crowd, she saw them, her mother, eyes filled with worry and joy, clutching a sign that read, "Welcome home, Grace." Her father stood beside her, tall but seemingly thinner than the last time she'd seen him, and her sister with her bright blonde hair that Grace had so often remembered in the darkest nights of the battlefield. In that moment, every sound of the airport seemed to fade away, leaving only the rapid beat of her heart and the sight of her family waiting with open arms. Her feet felt heavy, wanting to run to them but also hesitant, as if unsure she truly deserved that love. She had returned, but she was no longer the same girl they had once known. Then her mother's eyes met hers, and a choked sob escaped her mother's throat. Grace couldn't hold back any longer. She ran, her heavy feet suddenly light as air, and in an instant she was wrapped in her family's embrace. She felt her mother's warmth, her father's trembling hand on her shoulder, and her sister's strong hug, all pulling her back to the present, reminding her that she was truly safe now. Through tears, her mother whispered, "You're home now, my love, you're finally home." Grace buried her face in her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent, feeling the gentle love she had longed for during all those stormy days. Yet mingled with that love was a pang of guilt for the things she had seen and could never fully share, for the friends who hadn't made it back as she had. "I was afraid I'd never see you again," Grace murmured, her voice trembling. Her father pulled her into an even tighter embrace. "We prayed for you every day, Grace. We never lost hope." And as she looked into their eyes, she realized that what she had lost was not only her comrades, but also part of herself, the part of her that once believed in justice and had faith in the future. But now she also realized that, in her family's embrace, she could rediscover what she had lost and learn to forgive herself. In those moments, she thought about the meaning of life, about its fragility and preciousness. She understood that she had fought not only to survive, but also for the hope that one day, upon returning, she could start anew, not by forgetting the painful memories, but by finding meaning in each one of them. She felt a blend of happiness and sadness, of pain and hope. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she could no longer distinguish those of loss from those of rebirth. She realized that, like every soldier, she had fought battles within her own mind that no one else could see, but now she was ready to face them, to reclaim who she had once been and accept who she had become. Her father gently patted her shoulder. "My dear, don't blame yourself. You did everything you could, and the most important thing is that you came back to us." Grace looked into her father's eyes, feeling his unconditional love, and a small spark ignited within her, a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she would learn to live with these painful memories without being overwhelmed by them. She nodded, tears still falling, but in her heart she felt a faint glimmer of hope. They walked out of the airport together, the morning sunlight gently covering them like a warm blanket. Her mother still held her hand tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, Grace would vanish. Her sister chatted excitedly about everything that had happened while she was gone, and Grace simply smiled, feeling life slowly returning to each heartbeat. As they got into the family car, Grace sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the familiar streets passing by. She knew that the journey ahead would still be challenging, that there would still be long nights, and that the nightmares might not disappear right away. But now she no longer had to face them alone. She had her family beside her, people who understood her, and even those she hadn't expected to find empathy from, like the man on that flight. A new feeling blossomed within Grace, a sense that she could start over, that she could turn her pain into strength. She realized that life was not only about overcoming challenges, but also about finding reasons to keep going, to find herself again amidst the scars and losses. When they arrived home, the family's small house with its familiar windows and green trees in the yard seemed to embrace her in peace. Grace stepped out of the car, taking in the sight she had once thought she would never see again. And in that moment she understood that she had found something more valuable than any victory on the battlefield. It was the sense of returning, of compassion for herself and others, and the meaning of being alive, even after all the losses. She crossed the threshold into the house, feeling the warmth of her family's home surrounding her, and for the first time in months she felt her heart truly beat again, stronger and more resilient than ever before.